Hola a todos, gracias por estar aquí, gracias al salón, mis alumnos de centro y a los invitados que vienen a escuchar la plática. Estamos muy contentos que está Mario Ballesteros, director de Archivo, Diseño y Arquitectura, y por primera vez con nosotros en Zona Maco, Giampietro, director de Diseño del MoMA de Nueva York. So please, perdón, la plática va a ser en inglés y los invito a que después hagan preguntas, por favor, que lo queremos abrir. Y bueno, les quiero dar la bienvenida a Rob y Mario. Gracias. Thank you.
Gracias.
Gracias. Yo me voy a disculpar también porque no solo por el inglés, sino porque traigo un tema de garganta desde el premaco de Guadalajara, pero espero que no se me vaya la voz. Yes, we have water. Not yet, but later. So we're going to switch to English. Si alguien tiene preguntas, dudas o hay algo que no entiendan, pues levanten la mano y podemos ahí hacer traducción simultánea, orgánica, como se pueda. And I think it's a great opportunity having Rob here with us. As many of you might know, the Museum of Modern Art in New York is not just a beacon of what modern art is and the history of modern art, but it's also sort of a very important reference for the history of design. So I think it's very interesting that in the context of Mako and the fair that has been also trying to understand what design in relationship to art is or can be, I think it's a privilege having Rob here with us to discuss some of these things. I think it's also a very interesting time because Rob, the position of Director of Design at MoMA, is a new position. It's a position that didn't exist last year, maybe. And so maybe the first question or the start of the conversation could be about understanding this what MoMA represents to design, and how maybe the museum has evolved from being very focused, especially in industrial design, like some of the most important early shows at MoMA, like Good Design, was actually like a little shop in a way. It was things I think under $5 that were sold as part of the exhibition, to the more contemporary sort of perspective being pushed by Paolo Antonelli and other experimental curators trying to expand the definition of design. And I think, Rob, that your position now in a way reflects that expansion. So if you want to just talk a little bit about how you got there, what you're doing, and then we can maybe go back to what it means.
Yeah, perfect. And I'm so pleased that this opportunity has brought us together. I've been a fan of Archivio's work for a long time, and obviously very delighted to be here in Mexico as part of this event. So yeah, as Mario said, the role of Director of Design is a somewhat new role, part of a kind of a new thinking about how curatorial activity and programmatic activity at the museum is thought of and supported. And you know, the position is created as part of a new entity at the museum called the Creative Team, which synthesizes things like digital media, graphics, marketing, editorial, which is a nascent but emerging area of the museum, and sort of it really though embodies and comes out of Alfred Barr's founding spirit of our institution as a kind of experimental laboratory. And so the idea that the sort of mission of the museum doesn't stop at its walls, but is in fact brought into culture in lots of different ways, is sort of the mantle of that has really been taken up by the creative team to sort of reach people in all the different ways that they want to be engaged and hear about our content and our programming and things like that. So as Director of Design, I think a lot of my job is actually just to sort of learn about all the different things that are happening at the museum and try to coordinate the way that those are visually expressed, the ways that those come to fruition, to do a certain amount of research and development. So solving problems that that maybe haven't been solved before. A really good example of this is that, as you might have heard, we are embarking on a new strategy for presenting our permanent collection. And I think this strategy is really radical for us because it mixes disciplines together, and it also changes the galleries themselves more often. And so, sort of how that filters into design is that suddenly the labels that are next to all of those pieces of art, there's a lot more of them, and they need to be created a lot more quickly. And so that actually becomes a kind of problem for design and research to solve, and it involves how is a label created? Who are the authors of that? What is the visual expression of that? And can we create some kind of platform that would allow my department to support, but also allow others to service themselves as labels need to be created or as shows are created in a more kind of improvisational way. And so that's just one example of the many kinds of projects that, in a more siloed structure are not as possible. So this sort of overarching synthetic kind of thing.
I think it's super interesting as a moment for the institution, and I guess lots of us have this idea of, especially an institution like the Museum of Modern Art, to be, I mean, we expect the definition of what a museum is, what a modern art museum is supposed to be and do. It seems that there's like a very sort of traditional perspective or idea of what that should be. And as you mentioned, MoMA has been also known for pushing these boundaries and sort of bringing these different perspectives and disciplines together. I mean, if we go back all the way to the early 1930s, when Philip Johnson, he did this very famous exhibition, Machine Arts, where he put up like basically industrial pieces on pedestals and showed them at the MoMA. So what's the reaction, or how are you trying to weave this new way of understanding? Because I can imagine it must be quite controversial and difficult. We, like in a very different context and in a very different sort of way, at Archivo we also try to push this holistic vision of what design is and can be. And we get a lot of resistance from the audience sometimes that doesn't really understand what they're seeing, from designers sometimes that like to see their projects in a certain way and logic and can't really fathom that we play around with their work. And then from the art world that sort of says that design is like a lesser version of art. So how is the museum trying to put this together?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to kind of, I'm a student of history. I think one of the things that has drawn me to MoMA has been its unflagging support of design from the beginning. You mentioned the show in the late 30s that was sort of a very important show called Design Under $5. So this was, or useful household objects for under $5. And this is a sort of amazing idea that, art is not something that is so expensive that you can't afford to buy it. You can have a very useful object that's very beautiful in your home for a price that you can afford. And I think this comes out of really the modernist project overall, because as you're espousing this new way of living, not everyone can immediately put paintings on their walls, but they can still live in a modern way. And so the museum was very, very interested in teaching people about how to live in a modern way. And maybe they would begin with an egg beater or a spatula, and they would graduate to a sort of unusual looking chair. And then eventually they would sort of, this art that might seem strange to them at first no longer seems quite strange and is instead sort of part of a way of living. And so I think very early on they recognized, along with other modern movements like the Bauhaus, that there weren't these lines between the disciplines as much, that instead there was kind of a universal modern way of living that needed to be taught and communicated and sort of built. And so, with Edgar Kaufman, who organized a lot of the early household objects shows. He was from a family that was involved in department stores. And so he understood how to bring a lot of these products, both receive them from the market and get them into the museum, and then also vice versa, bring them from the museum back out into the market. But I think in terms of like the new maybe barriers that you were talking about, I think in a way the new presentation of the collection actually allows us to restore that more experimental kind of spirit. So it's impossible to understand the Bauhaus without understanding that they were making what we would call art objects and design objects together. And so in a sense, we're kind of giving a better version of the Bauhaus by having those disciplines mixed together in the same place.
I know that the museum is relaunching its Good Design exhibition, I think, in some months. How do you think the definition or MoMA's perspective on what good design is has changed over the years?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because it really, good design, it sounds to our ears now like a judgment, like it's like this is good, this is bad, and so it's a very kind of usefully but also sort of controversially named movement, because it actually was a movement that at MoMA we think of as happening sort of during a specific period of time from the late 30s into the mid 50s or so, and it even had like letterhead like news from good design. They would put press releases out. So the show really explores kind of everything that happened to facilitate and stabilize that movement at MoMA, which I think was really just about activating people to say, you have choices in terms of the things you put in your home, and let us tell you a little bit about what those choices might be. You could buy this spoon just kind of off the rack, or you could look at this very beautiful spoon that is sort of using materials in a thoughtful way that may have other purposes within your home and all of these kinds of things. So I think that, that the beginnings of that sense of the quality of the manufacturing, the sort of vision of the designer, the useful aspects of the design, all of those things I think were crystallized by good design. Now they had a kind of ancillary kind of usefulness because they would connect the museum to industry in lots of different ways. They would extend, there was a presentation every year of the Good Design program at the Merchandise Mart in Chicago. And so this was a chance for sort of the thinking about housewares and things at the museum to extend into these other places where the museum was not. So I think it was a really good kind of strategy for changing people's minds. It was a really good strategy for connecting industry to the arts. And I think a lot of the legacy of that has endured. So at the presentation of the show, which I should mention is curated by my colleagues Julia Kinchin and Andrew Gardner in the Architecture and Design Department, there's actually a presentation of some of the things that are available at the MoMA Design Store, which also grows out of that impulse to sort of bring design to you and make it accessible to you in ways that it might not otherwise be. And so something like the Chemex coffee maker, which was part of the original Good Design show, is beautiful because it's made of two components. It's made out of very everyday materials like glass and wood, and so its spirit is resonant for things that we still put in the design store today, things that are just sort of very beautifully simply made, affordable, and enduring.
Yeah, I think it's a great initiative, and I think this very basic idea of you can buy good design for under $5, or maybe now it's maybe 25, but still. And especially in the context of a fair like MACO and in a place like Mexico where maybe we don't have that clarity of what design can be or how design can sort of move or find its position. I think even though there's these initiatives that have been going on for 10, 15 years of trying to bring design into its own and sort of have people understand what design is about without the support of like a design museum or an institution like MoMA pushing and sort of developing this perspective. I think we're still a little on the fence, and some people have an idea and others have a different idea, but I think that something that is still sort of prevalent is that maybe good design is the design that can be as expensive as art, as contemporary art. You know, if you can sell a piece for thousands of dollars, then it's bound to be good, which is, I don't think, necessarily the case. So, I mean, what is your, and I know this has nothing to do with what you're doing now, but just out of curiosity, do you see this movement of design into the realm of sort of like the collectible art market as something that is good for design, is positive for really opening up a design sort of culture? How do you perceive that?
Well, I mean, I think in terms of like the first part of your question is sort of, haven't we defined what design is? Why do we have to keep defining it? And in a sense, that's because I think design has expanded radically from where kind of its origins in just industrial manufacturing. And so what we call design now is everything from, you know, making a pair of scissors to complex like business processes of how businesses change and evolve over time. All of the, you know, there's the thing called design thinking in the U.S. that literally is helping CEOs redesign their companies and things like this. So when you're always expanding the field, you kind of have to keep re-articulating to everyone what that is. I think in terms of how people absorb design themselves, you know, a lot of your relationship to design, like your relationship to art, happens as you grow up. And so I think that as new generations grow up with different sort of social contexts and factors, they have different needs from design, you know? So I think one of the kind of urgent needs right now is sustainability, for example. You know, we need design to be much more conscious of how we use precious materials. We may want it also to be more supportive of local communities. And that wasn't necessarily the context at MoMA in the 30s. It was a little bit different from that. It was, you know, mass manufacturing at very low prices. But, you know, I might be willing to pay more for an apple that is grown near my house than I would be from one that has to be shipped across the country. And I think design, in a way, has some of those similar movements over time. I think in terms of like the art object or the very expensive design object, I mean, I think it's natural as people to coordinate price with quality, and I think I'm making a small argument for that, to say, you know, you would pay more for good fruit rather than cheap fruit or something like that, or bad fruit. But I think on another level, I think designers have every right to experiment and make things that are useless if they wish, or expensive if they wish, and as long as they can find a market for that, I think, or even if they can't, they should still take those risks and do those things. And, you know, I would point to the Eameses, who, you know, manufactured, but in a very limited quantity, the Lachaise, which is in the Value of Good Design show, but which is extremely expensive even now. It's a very complex design to execute, and it's a very sculptural. You know, it's not the only chair you'd ever have in your house. It's kind of a very sculptural object. And yet it's really beautiful, it's really inspiring, it challenges our notions of what design can be, and I think that that's, you know, the reason to make it and the reason to try. So I think that, you know, in the same way that artists move broadly in terms of the realms that they engage, designers have always and should always do the same.
Now maybe going a little bit closer to what you're actually doing now at MoMA, and this thing also in Mexico, we don't have a dedicated space, like a big institution or place where you can go to learn about design, like a design museum or something like MoMA that has design as part of its programming. But I also think that today the space is one thing and it's important, but everything that's beyond the space itself is very important. And I think that MoMA has, through its website, through making its archives public, digital, available to all. I mean, for those of you who haven't seen the website of the Museum of Modern Art, you can see every single show on the MoMA. You can see photos of the installs. You can download press releases. You can download the catalogs that are out of print. I mean, that is a huge resource and a huge wealth. That is, I would say, just as important or maybe even more important than the building and the physical space itself. how are you thinking about these digital resources? And I believe that's closer to your expertise and what you're doing now. How are you understanding that wealth of resources, and how do you handle them?
Yeah, so I mean, I think in terms of my own practice as a designer, I think I really believe that being a designer is being of your time, is responding to your own time, because design objects, are made and very, at a slightly quicker time pace sometimes than art objects are. So design can be responsive to the moment in different ways than art. And I think that in terms of my own practice, I've always seen digital as an opportunity of our time, as sort of a way to push design forward that's unique to this present moment. And the processes we develop and the kind of methods that we employ in digital that we establish now will actually propel us forward in a lot of different ways. So I, early in my work, decided to focus a lot on websites and interactive design, which brought me to Google, and it's from Google that I came to MoMA. So I'm really, really passionate about these things. One of the things that I worked on at Google was a set of technologies for image recognition, so that essentially when you take a picture and it recognizes a barcode, or it recognizes a particular sneaker in that image, and you're able to match what that is, and so you can buy it or something like that. Those technologies have also been used by MoMA just before I arrived, by my colleague Shannon Darrow in the digital media department, to recognize artworks in all of our collection images that were unrecognized, or because we had too many collection images over the years, we couldn't hand tag all of those different images. And so with the aid of artificial intelligence and machine learning, we were able to categorize all of that stuff. Now that's a cool story. It's also really important for accessibility, because essentially we're making things from that would have sat in a drawer 10 years ago accessible to you online and more findable by you through the way that we're tagging them and doing the image recognition on them. So for me, technology's never really there. Sometimes it's there to dazzle us, and we can have a moment where we're just awed by a VR experience that someone might create. But very often it's actually there to serve our needs more than it is to kind of dazzle us on its own. The dazzling experience becomes sort of fatiguing if it's the only aspect of an experience. But when you can find a little-known artist in an exhibition image from 20 years ago that no one had ever mentioned was in the MoMA collection, and you find that on a Google search, it's really quite thrilling. And yet you don't even think about all the kind of pieces of technology that are organized around doing that. So I think some aspects of the website are just, how do we modernize it? How do we make it more useful to the many different audiences that are accessing it every day? And then I think there's also a visual design aspect of that, which is, how do we make new experiences possible on the website? So how do we make long-form reading experiences possible? We do a lot of writing and publishing at the museum. We put it up in the walls of the museum. Sometimes we give you a leaflet about it. Sometimes we make a nice catalog about it. But that's not in the age of the web, that's not the only ways that we can publish. And so we want to have a much broader canvas, and the web, I think, is really going to allow us to do that. So we're building a lot of those kind of things now.
And in that sense, how do you see museums? I mean, I think we're living in interesting times, to say the least. I think we're living in difficult times and trying times for institutions and for the idea of what everything from democracy to schools to museums are about, should be, and how they can help us move forward, basically, and not kill each other in the near future. So how do you see the role of the museum in 20, 30, 50 years moving on? I mean, is MoMA thinking about this in that longer term? Are there changes? I mean, do these recent changes have to do with that sort of how we're going to move forward through technology, through accessibility, through a different reading of the program? I know there's like this very intense sort of intention of bringing diversity as well, like these social aspects, women having been relegated from the gallery walls in so many museums and in the history of modernism, art from other parts that are not Europe or the US. So how do you see legendary institutions like MoMA changing and readapting their role towards the future?
I mean, I think that, you know, it's such a well thought out question, because I think that part of what draws me to working at a museum is the different timescales of the work that we do at a museum. And so, you know, we have stewardship of all of these incredible objects that, you know, need to be conserved and carefully handled. And, you know, we need to think a lot about the way that light degrades them, or fingerprints degrade them, or all of these different things. And so that's a time scale of 50 years or more. But I think, you know, MoMA's spirit is an experimental one. And I think part of the way that we animate those objects rather than just ossify and preserve them, and the way that we animate social discussion around those objects, is to keep kind of, you know, circling back and rephrasing what we think, why we think it, how we can interpret these things, who's part of that discussion, and all of these different things. And so I think diversity is absolutely critical, because, you know, there has been earlier versions of the story of modernism that have left people out, or that have not been as rich as they could be. And I think it's to MoMA's credit to actually expand those discussions and try to kind of address them directly rather than sort of apologize for them or whatever. So I think the discussion about art is evolving, is iterative. That's what makes it vital and alive. And I think, you know, that's a huge part of why, as you bring new technologies and things into, and new design experiences into the museum, it's really just continuing in that experimental spirit of what is thrilling about works of art.
I mean, I could go on. I have a bunch of questions, but I kind of would like to maybe hear and just open the floor to questions from the audience who can join in the conversation, maybe, if anyone has a question.
Hi. I don't have a question. I just wanted to say something that was very important. I thought for MoMA you were talking about discovering unknown designers, and Museum of Modern Art had the very first showing of the Campana brothers and bought the very first chair that they ever sold. So I thought that says something about our department. And I disagree a little bit about the space that's allotted to the design department, and architecture and design occupy a lot of space. It's not an independent museum, but it certainly holds its own. And as you say, then the digital part complements it very much. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say.
Yeah, I should note too, I think one of the special things in the reinstallation is that some of the design and architecture galleries will remain, but also we are looking for lots of opportunities to integrate the architecture and design elements of the collection into these kind of de-siloed or interdepartmental presentations of the collection. So, you know, we know that we have an audience that kind of comes in the front door and says, "Where's design?" And, you know, I think that it's important to have a way to kind of address those questions. But I think also, hopefully for those visitors that are very maybe unitary in their interest, still offer them something that's a little bit more expansive. So I'm excited about the kind of yin-yang of having both options available.
I was very interested to hear what you had to say, because it struck me that the Museum of Modern Art would have a director of design. How long has this role existed in the museum, and what's your role really entailing?
It's a great question. So yeah, so the role is relatively new. I've been at the museum for 9 months, which is like a blip in MoMA years. And as I said, time scales much longer. But I think there has been creative directors of the museum. There's been there's a graphics department that's a long-standing department, and really I think my job is to help lead the graphics department, but also there are lots of other pockets of design happening at the museum, and lots of other departments that touch design in other ways, like marketing or like curatorial, like presenting shows, or our exhibition design and production department, which is installing shows and making walls and all of those things. So I think the director of design, at least as I've thought of it, is just a much more cross-functional role that kind of is trying to weave into all these different discussions and think about them from a design perspective and offer ideas. And I think in terms of when I have to operationalize those things and get people to help me execute those sorts of solutions, I have a team of about 20 that spans both the retail creative and the creative team itself. And I think that already is sort of a little bit of a more integrated approach than we've taken before. We've typically had retail separate from our creative side of the museum, and I think being able to have those conversations be more fluid, particularly in this critical moment where we're communicating our expansion later this fall, it just allows us to be much more all reading from the same page. So I think whether it's brand and having the brand of MoMA, which is just such an incredible kind of, it means something to you. You know, I think everybody sees our MoMA, and it means something to them about an experience that they've had in their lives. They've touched that, they've seen an object that changed them, and when they see our logo, they're reminded of that. So, you know, a lot of my job is also to steward that object and make sure that it is carefully and thoughtfully handled and positioned. And so when you have lots of different people independently handling it, it's just sort of nice to have someone who's conducting that orchestra of input. So yeah, I mean, very concretely, that's kind of how I work every day. I should add too, like we make all the advertising for the museum, so which increasingly is programmatic advertising on digital. So, you know, I have animators on my team and all sorts of different things. Really how we reach the public in close coordination with Rob Baker, our director of marketing, Leah Dickerman, our head of content, just, you know, head of editorial. That's like a really tight conversation that we're having every day.
My question was, what are the challenges about bringing design to a modern art museum and explaining it to people that does not understand what design is and not putting it like something that it's for only rich people or only that people that can afford that? I don't know what.
Well, I think it's a good question. I mean, I think that one of the things that I'm very conscious of in terms of how we message our shows is to make sure that there's an invitation that's being made in terms of the way that the creative is handled and in terms of the way that the visuals come together with the words. You know, there's a lot of people that are uncomfortable. They might be excited to come to the art museum, but they also might be uncomfortable that they're not going to understand something. And I think that's true for design, that's true for art, that's true for new kinds of performance experiences and things like that. And you know, the worst thing that could happen is that you know, they feel that the ad is making it even more obscure for them, or the title wall is just sort of even more difficult for them to access. So I think a lot about the design, the role that design plays in terms of my department is like inviting you to make that feel comfortable, to make that feel accessible to you, so that you don't kind of have that concern that it's not going to be something you're going to understand or something like that. And I'm sure if that answers your question, but.
I have a question also maybe related to the same thing. Like you said that in the vision for the next for the future of institutions has to do with diversity and a spirit of experimentation, and that you are trying to make a narrative that includes more voices, or no, to define what's modern or good design, right? So I would like to know, like for you in this vision, which are the different stakeholders that should be part of that discussion?
In terms of at the museum or outside the museum? Or?
In terms of like MoMA in the future, if you would like to create a new narrative that it's more inclusive, like who are those voices that have to be part of that discussion to define
Totally. I mean, I think first of all,
like in your opinion or in institutions, or I don't know if you, I would like to hear an answer that it doesn't come from the institution, but from yourself. Because like you have now this role, right? And it, sometimes what you think doesn't really, sometimes it's not completely aligned with what the institution is now allowing you to do, but like ideally, how do you see this discussion could be like very, very rich if you have all the voices? Which are those voices, in your opinion?
Absolutely. I mean, and you know, I speak knowing that I am a white man, and I want to like sort of check my privilege for a moment and say, I think that one of the first things that I do is reach out to lots of people across my team, foster a diverse team, lead by reinforcing diversity and inclusion, you know, ask people to feedback on how we're doing about that. So some of my stakeholders are in my department and my team, just, you know, how are we doing, you know? But I think that there's also a great investment. I mean, I really have to say at the museum, it comes from the top. It comes from our director, Glenn. And there's so much research and scholarship that's being done at the museum through like things like the CMAP program, through the Cisneros Institute. You're going to hear from Inez and Glenn later today. You know, I think as a designer working in that context, those are all offerings to me and my team in terms of how to present the material that's coming out of that research in a way that sort of invites and expands the everyday person's perception of what MoMA like is featuring or is on our walls. And I think that that is a process. It takes a long time to kind of change those public perceptions, but I'm absolutely dedicated to it. You know, I think it's so important, and I'm really excited in our kind of reopening moment to have the Sur Moderno show that Inez is organizing, which I think makes it plain that modernism was a pervasive phenomenon all across the world, and that there was a lot of geometric abstraction happening in places that had very different contexts from Switzerland or you know, the UK or the US. You know, and I think just being able to reinforce and amplify those kinds of insights from research are, for me, very powerful and the best way to kind of change the discussion.
Yeah, I just want to say that my question comes from like a very deep concern that I have for a very, very long time, that the story of design and art history has been like very like short-minded and limited, because it's the story of like European history. No, it's the story of like a very single-pointed view. No, so and I think diversity and experimental spirit has to always take the risk of including other stories, and I think Mexico has like all these voices that speak in a very low voice, but that are very, very rich. What we were talking about before this.
Just very quickly follow up on Kitsia's question, because I think she touched a very relevant question. And I think, just going back before maybe Jimena, also architecture and design as disciplines, as professional disciplines, have a very bad track record of being diverse and having these voices integrated. I mean, if in an institution like in a museum it's difficult, in arts and in design and architecture, I mean, there's even, I would dare say, less opportunities and diversity. I mean, it's changing, but how do you, I mean, how relevant this is, because I think also, for example, women in architecture and design, which has been a theme that has come up recently here and in other places, and lots of female architects are reluctant to have them be categorized as, I'm a female architect, you know? they want to be recognized for their work regardless of their gender. And so there's this uncomfortable thing of, should we be speaking about gender? Do we need to be marking those differences now? Aren't we over that? Aren't we all equal now? And can we just get to it and just forget that we're women practicing architecture? So, I mean, and this is something that we are constantly seeing too in Archivo. I mean, we're a younger institution, but we see a very different sort of a generational gap as well in how people understand what they're doing. So, yeah, I mean, with these super complex issues that change maybe from a month to like last year, you could say things that you can't say today because of certain situations. So how can you, as a big institution with all these responsibilities, sort of be on that edge?
I mean, I think it's not a discussion that ever is finished, you know, and I think that that's really important, is that there's never this moment where you're like, we're over it. Like, I think honestly what is required is for allyship, for the people that are pushing that discussion forward to not always be the people most impacted by it, but for them to find allies to take up that cause and push it forward as well. And, you know, so in terms of the role that I can play, I think that's a big one. Is asking how we're doing, is looking for ideas around that, and is, I think, allowing people to bring their whole selves to the workplace every day. So, you know, I think at MoMA we have a much better kind of gender balance than, you know, at Google where I worked before. And I think, you know, part of the issue of that was that there was a kind of a culture of a certain expected culture that was a little bit more masculine or whatever, and that it needed to be a more inclusive, generous culture where people could bring their whole selves to the office every day and be who they were. I think at MoMA we have a greater diversity there. We have a lot of artists, a lot of people who are outspoken, who are comfortable and invited to express their point of view. And I think that those are really great things. I think you just don't get complacent. You know, you continue to kind of keep that cause top of mind. You acknowledge that people need, you know, if they're coming from different backgrounds, they may need different pay, they may be at different points in their life experience in terms of having families and different things like that. But that doesn't make them in my opinion, any less of a great designer. And we have to find room to have diversity on our teams always, you know, so.
Like, just to wrap up, maybe Kitsia's question, I mean, what I think you were asking is that if you could imagine a collection or a program that, for example, could integrate, instead of calling indigenous patterns, you could call it, instead of anthropology, you could call it design. And maybe you could bring up those subjects to this narrative where you kind of analyze them and give them like historical context, but also acknowledging their value as a design object that has influenced Annie Albers, Clara Porset, and so many modern designers that took from that tradition and brought it into life in their objects and into modern tradition. But maybe what you're asking is that at this point in history, could MoMA open up to those cultures, and instead of calling them indigenous and maybe the past, they're like so alive and present and still doing these crafts, but they're not just craft, they are design, and maybe we could bring them into New York MoMA and like an actual program. Are you asking for that? Like, okay.
Where do we
Yes, I was
sign up?
not asking for the team diversity, but more for the discourse.
Yeah.
The diversity of the discourse, that it's what we are dying for.
Yeah. I mean, you know, I think to sort of say back, I think good design is not exclusive, it's inclusive, and I think that it's really important to have the kind of dialogue that we're having right now, so that, you know, I think it's not just Annie Albers that makes it design, right? It's design. Human beings make design, and they always have. And so I think that that's like kind of an institutional hiccup, not a it's something that needs to be kind of continually retold when you tell the story of art. And that's the opportunity of not standing still, is to kind of keep looking at where did you not tell the story fully enough, and how can you tell it in a fuller way and in a more thoughtful way. And I know, I mean, you know, in Sur Moderno, I know Inez specifically has, you know, baskets and other things that are, and she'll talk more about this maybe this afternoon, but, you know, that are there to show how geometric patterns were processed by a different community of people looking at the everyday objects that were around them, rather than sort of that were authenticated or officialized by people functioning in an art context, in a Western context. You know, so I think that's totally going to happen, probably not fast enough, but should and will happen.
Going back a little bit, with society growing a little bit more sensitive and more offended by everything, how do you think it affects how MoMA can approach what they show there, and what's allowed to be showed and what's allowed to be talked about?
Well, I mean, maybe to tie this question together with the last for a second, I mean, I think that, like, to go back to useful objects, which was, I think, 38 in the museum, I mean, there's a pair of scissors on a plinth, and the public comes in and they're like, what is this? This is not art. This doesn't belong in a museum. You know, and I think it's a museum's responsibility. And they didn't think of it as something that someone made, you know, even though there was someone who sat with a drawing table and designed those scissors, and that designer maybe wasn't recognized, the manufacturer was recognized. In fact, in some of our labels still today, the design labels, the manufacturer is credited, not necessarily the individual designer. So I think these problems really, they're pervasive. I mean, they're also localized, but they're very pervasive across lots of different things. And I think all that a museum can do in that case is not sort of shy away from pushing that edge. And inviting the public to take part. And I think that is why, even though it's important that we have a website and it's important that we have all these other areas to have discourse, it's still really important that we put the objects in a space where you can stand next to someone who's different from you and experience them and think about them and relate to them. I think it's actually a very unusual thing in our time, when the mediation of how we processed cultural information, political information, and everything else is so compartmentalized and specialized to each of our own feeds and each of our own things. I think it's still really important to encounter a curatorial vision that is coming from a high degree of expertise and is able to sort of guide you through perhaps a different set of thoughts or ideas about what belongs in a museum or who gets to speak or whatever. It's just, I think it's really, really important to keep supporting that process. So, you know, I think the worst thing, you know, I'll point to, you know, when the Trump travel ban was issued, MoMA quickly responded to put works from our permanent collection from all the countries affected by the travel ban on the walls of MoMA. I mean, I think that's a way that you kind of really, it's like a rapid response creation, to not necessarily directly push back, but to very clearly to a public say, there are makers in all of these cultures that belong in our permanent collection and that belong here at an American museum. And I think that's a powerful and constructive way to respond to sort of, I think, maybe less inclusive discussions or political agendas. So I don't know if that directly answers your question, but I think it's, yeah.
Bueno, si no hay más preguntas.
Creating the @ symbol? Yeah.
Sorry, I think just the last one, but I think to continue with all these the questions and discussion, like I think the MoMA always pushes forward, no? It's always like not what it's expected, no? But like a little bit with the story about the @ symbol, no? That acquired something that's in the public domain, and it was like all this discussion, and people were like, why do you have it? Because it's something that we want people to know about it, you know? So maybe you can wrap it up a little bit and tell us.
Yeah, so I think for a number of years, Paolo's been acquiring objects that are sort of maybe not objects. They're more like icons, cultural icons, or things that are digital in nature or by origin. So she's acquired a number of important, influential digital typefaces, video games, and I think also some of these symbols like the emoji set, the original Docomo Japanese emoji set, which we're reinstalling for our reopening, as well as the @ symbol. And I think the @ symbol is a great example of a kind of how design changes over time, because that symbol has been with us since the Renaissance or before then, and has been part of typewriters for since their production, and yet was sort of not really used. And yet when you need to talk about how to presence a human being in a digital network, the @ symbol as a form of attribution is a really compact, really efficient way of doing that, and has sort of changed from being this kind of weird symbol on the top row of a typewriter that you never type with, to being something that is connected to our own identities and the ways that we express ourselves. So I think what a museum is there to do is recognize that and crystallize that insight and offer it back to you to think about and experience in a way that you maybe haven't thought about. And I think the other thing that's important about timescales is it sort of slows you down to be able to have that thought and to be able to, maybe you don't need to see it on a wall to have that thought, but maybe you do. Maybe you need to put your body in a space, in a design gallery where that thing is there so that you can think about that for a minute. I think that that's why I've enjoyed coming to the museum from when I was very young, and it's always been a place for me to kind of have new thoughts and insights and experiences, and I'm sure it will continue to. So,
well, thanks very much, Rob. It's been amazing. Creo que es un privilegio tener una perspectiva de un lugar como el MoMA, y I think it's very refreshing to see that lots of the questions and concerns we have here, with a totally different sets of infrastructure and possibilities, are resonating with the questions and the possibilities of a place like that. So thank you everyone for listening. Gracias a Ceci también por invitarnos.